document explicitly says that perpetual expansion of NATO is a very bad idea, and that the United States no longer supports it. Furthermore, they refer to the war in Ukraine as something that has to be, I'm sorry, something that has to end, and that Russia has to become part of the new European security architecture. So, that's obviously a departure from the current agenda of the European, let's call them elites. And so it obviously marks a very significant departure of the way current global affairs are being mentioned. And then it also takes a swipe at the European Union. And at the same time, it claims the European allies are extremely important to the United States, but they support sovereigntist movements in Europe rather than an agglomeration of the European Union into some kind of a monoculture of under the political diktat of Brussels or the city of London. So I think that's quite a radical change, and maybe it has been fairly obvious to everyone who has been paying attention since the start of the Trump administration. But now that it's, written down in black and white, including some very pointed criticisms of the European policies, I think it's undeniable. And, what this document says, in effect, is that, the European allies are our allies insofar as we insofar as we share certain values and certain policies that have to include things like democracy and human rights and rights to free speech. And if the European Union, European countries diverge from those values, then they can no longer be our allies. That is all spelled out in the document. So, for people in Brussels, for people like Ursula von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas and Friedrich Merz and Emmanuel Macron, it's very difficult to deny this. It's very difficult to pretend that this is not there. I think it strengthens the arguments of sovereigntist movements in Europe, and it very much weakens the arguments of the, pan-Europeanists who are right now hell-bent on going to war against Russia, on stomping out free speech, on canceling elections, and so forth. And so, this document is a subtle condemnation of all those tendencies, with the implication that if you go that way, we're no longer allies.
Yeah, this is the going after the criticizing the EU is quite fascinating. I mean, the language there was quite strong
Yes.
compared to the there was not that harsh tax against Russia in any way, but against the EU, it essentially blamed the European leaders for refusing to end the war in Ukraine. It pointed at the reason towards this as them being undemocratic, authoritarian, purging media, political opposition. I mean, this it reminded me a bit about when J.D. Vance went to the Munich Security Conference and said that Europe's enemies were domestic, which meant our leaders, or that they're the ones who are now terrible. And as I said, there's also a note in there where it says that one of the solutions has to be to cultivate resistance to Europe's current trajectory within European nations. It's not quite a regime change, but it does suggest that the US should help Europe to get off its current path, which is by our undemocratic authoritarian leaders, essentially. This is quite a damning document for the Europeans who've been doing the European leaders have been doing everything they can in terms of showing their obedience, hoping to win the affection of Trump.
Yes, correct. There are some very explicit statements in there, which in fact imply that the United States will work with European nations, with certain structures of European nations to change their current policy. I'm trying to find it, but here, for example, it says, quote, American diplomacy should continue to stand up for genuine democracy, freedom of expression, and unapologetic celebration of European nations' individual character and history. Uh, America encourages its political allies in Europe to promote this revival of spirit, and the growing influence of patriotic European parties indeed gives cause for great optimism. So, Europeans could, well, Europeans, let's call it the still dominant EU centered structures could rightly interpret this as Americans interference in their internal affairs. But at this stage, this interference will be very much welcomed by uh, many forces in the EU, which today might be silent, but might be so strong that they could probably overturn the the old order on a very short notice. Um, the support for parties like AfD in Germany, support for sovereigntist parties on the left and on the right in France, Italy, other European countries is probably it's silent, but it's a giant that maybe just needed this signal from the United States to be more assertive. And so, political options like Macron, Merz, Starmer, they're on the back foot, and this is quite a devastating blow for them. Now, especially, let's say outside of this agreement, there's also now a concrete conflict that is completely relevant to this document, and that is Europe's attempt to censor and silence Elon Musk's X, trying to force him to censor free speech in Europe, and then even imposing $120 million fines for them for refusing to censor free speech in Europe. And we've also seen that X has become the number one source of news uh, for all countries in the European Union. So this is like a huge battle that's taking shape, which the Europeans are almost certainly going to lose. And so, the consequences of that are probably going to play out in the very short term, in the next several months. But I think it might lead to a wave of regime changes in Europe. And I found it very interesting that, okay, so we don't have this officially confirmed, but according to the German journalist Patrick Babb, with whom I think you interviewed him very recently, if I'm not
Yeah, two
mistaken.
days ago.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So he was saying that one of the things that were being discussed in Moscow last week was the reconnection of the Nord Stream pipelines, which is extremely interesting in light of the fact that there were no German representatives in Moscow. And so, to me, the implication of this is that the United States is anticipating that there will be a change in government in Germany, which, Germany is still the biggest power in Europe, in the European Union. And so that could in fact lead to the disintegration of the European Union if AfD gets to form the next government.
Well, certainly a lot of the comments which came out in this new national security strategy, I think would be welcomed by AfD, Marine Le Pen, and a lot of the political forces which have been marginalized across Europe. This of course is not being received well in Europe at all. I mean, if there's anything predictable about the EU leaders is that every sentence have to be filled up with praise of their own values all the time. And I often make the point, if you have to always talk about about your great values, then perhaps there's some problems there.